Welcome to a special series of programs on the future of humanism. I'm Bill Weir, the producer of this video that takes you to the conference on the future of humanism at the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis in October 2016, where we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the beginning of congregational humanism, the humanism that was led by Reverend John Dietrich at the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis for many decades. But now it's time to hear new voices for humanism.
One thing I would say in response to this, I really appreciated this conversation about mystery and certainty. And I think that one perspective that I would love to see lifted up more, and it's very much on my mind because actually just last week a member of our community came to me and was talking about how she feels that we don't have space in our community for mystery. Not just an acceptance of mystery, but actually a sort of radical embrace of it, an enthusiasm for mystery, a mystery as a source of stretching and learning and growing and being challenged. And I agree that I think that there's a real discomfort with it, that even, that I feel, that many feel. And I also pulled up something to read. A few years ago, I interviewed Monica Miller, who does really amazing work in humanism. And I want to just share something that she said in response to a question I asked. I asked her, what can white atheists do to better address white privilege and systemic racism? And what can they learn from historical and contemporary expressions of African American humanism? And I loved her response. She said, much of what I've already noted in our conversation so far, but a more fundamental point is also worth noting. There is something to be learned from African American humanism and African American culture more generally about a certain knowledge about how to live with uncertainty. Many brands of humanism and atheism more specifically echo hollow suggestions about knowing with certainty that we're alone, that science can help us, etc., etc. To this extent, certain folks we love and read and listen to as prominent humanist voices, could do with a dose of humility made possible by recognition that life is uncertain, life is tenuous. Humanism for many is a life orientation, and it's a little different, in my opinion, from white Christianity if it acts as if that orientation provides a certain foundation for social life. Life is hard, life is complicated, it is confusing, and none of us have answers as to why humans can seemingly do such dastardly things, fear difference, and the like. If white atheists want to do better to address white privilege, then they do well to dislodge their epistemological foundations from certain moorings. In less poetic language, I simply mean that white privilege has a lot to do with feeling certain, secure, safe. If atheists want to really tackle such long-standing problems and challenges, then they would start off, well, by adopting a brand of atheism or humanism rooted in uncertainty, a celebration of difference not simply for what benefits and beauty it holds, but for its effects to unsettle. Learning to live uncertainly in an uncertain world is what humanism at its best is all about, and I've learned much of this from African American humanism. So I think a challenge that I would put to myself and to others is to try to live into uncertainty more, not as something to accept or tolerate, but rather as a generative source for learning and stretching and growing, and for humanism becoming a more expansive humanism that I think many of us have articulated a desire to see.
I agree in large part with Sunita, but if I entertain the question, I have to say I'm not quite convinced humanist movements are ready for it. That it's a PC question, a question of anxiety, but it seems to me the more fundamental question is, what are humanist movements, humanist organizations ready to give up? Because my experience has been what folks really mean by that are different shades of the same. We want different shades of the same. Come in so we can see you, but don't change anything.
Okay, everybody who's nodding up here.
Well, I'll just add, I agree with everything that's been said. I also would like to just think, I think I would like to see a more global humanism, and by that I mean not just limiting to the social constructs here in the United States and the racial formations here in this country, but to just look beyond to, for example, India, Asia, Africa, Latin America. I mean, there's so many voices of humanism that come from different parts of the planet that I just think we need to be listening to more, sharing more, promulgating more, and they're just to me, it's just very exciting, and I just wanted to throw that out.
I have nothing to add.
All right.
I have another one too. Then on that, and I'm asking this as a question. I don't think anybody ever talks about Shakespeare, but I don't see any theism in Shakespeare. Am I missing something? There's no Jesus. There's no blood of Jesus. There's very little theism. I think Shakespeare is the great humanist voice that no one ever talks about. This guy is writing hundreds and hundreds of years ago when everybody was supposedly so religious, and I just think that that's yet another wellspring. And maybe I'm wrong, but the little limited Shakespeare I know, I'm no Shakespeare scholar, but I've read a lot of plays, I perform in a lot of them. I think he's expressing the humanistic worldview par excellence. I think he was secular, even though he didn't have that word in his rich vocabulary. So I don't know if others feel that way.
What about the ghost? What about Shakespeare's ghost?
Well, and also he was writing in a time of significant religious upheaval. Not talking about religion was probably a good thing. Doesn't necessarily mean he was a humanist, but
there's a
bigger
challenge.
audience.
How much can you tell based upon what is written? So, for example, if we use that standard, James Weldon Johnson was a Christian, right? Because he wrote God's Trombones. He gives us the Black National Anthem, yeah? So he would be a Christian. Or W.E.B. Du Bois. How often have you heard the argument he was a Christian because he wrote about the black church?
All right, well, we do have time to take at least a couple of questions from the audience. I am gonna hear first, since we're here celebrating the 100 years since the Dietrich founded this. Does anybody here have any comments on Dietrich's work? Since we're here celebrating Dietrich's work, and much of it has fallen out of common knowledge, he was asking whether any of the panelists have any comment on his work.
I like John Dietrich, right? I started by mentioning that. I think there are ways in which he provides an opportunity. There's a kind of, and I'll use this language cautiously, there's a kind of grace to the writing, right? The same sort of grace I sense with James Baldwin, an ability to engage populations of counterpoint based upon a shared sense of wonder and awe about human life and human capacity. It's a bit too optimistic for me, but I'll take into consideration the time frame, right? But the sense in which he understands, I think there are ways in which he and Thoreau, for example, would have been buddies, right? The idea that it's not just about doing good stuff, right? Thoreau says, giving somebody something to eat when they're hungry or something to drink when they're thirsty or some clothes, well, you can find a Newfoundland dog that can do as much. The challenge for him isn't doing good, it's being good. And I think you get that sense, a moral and ethical vision, a posture towards life with John Dietrich that revolves around being good, and from that posture, everything else flows.
George, you had a question? Oh, I'm sorry, did anybody else want to address Dietrich? I think you're a big fan. Okay, George. All right, George wanted to know whether the panelists think that the source of humanist values is, and these are not my words, well, basically what the source is of our values.
I would question the or. I don't think we have to pick. They're all of the above. I think that's a false. We don't have to choose between deontological and consequentialist, or we can enjoy Kant and Mill over our breakfast cereal. So I just wanted to throw that out.
And I would only add that I agree totally that we all, in fact, use a plurality of moral languages. We use different moral languages in different contexts. And I actually think your question is not about the sources so much as the types.
Well, to quote some sources, the seventh principle in UU is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, which can be read in theistic or humanist or atheist terms. And the third principle of the Humanist Manifesto is that values are derived from human need and interest as tested by experience. So the panorama, that whole spectrum of material, moral, psychological, emotional needs, and I would emphasize the material experience as the source of a humanistic inquiry.
All right, any other? Looking for questions just at the moment. So we got a brief comment on Dietrich's views on the future of humanism, and a question as to whether any of our panelists, and I think, Tony, this is going to be you again because you're the Dietrich fan, have any comment on his thoughts on the future of humanism.
There are things he could not anticipate, like social media, right? But unless I'm mistaken, he's also reading the existentialist near the end, right? Before 57, he's reading the existentialist, and he's toying with ideas concerning pantheism, right? So there are a variety of ways in which his thought is shifting and changing, and depending on, I'm not clear on which existentialist he found most compelling, but the idea that he's turning to them would raise questions concerning a modification of his understanding of freedom, right? And what it means to be authentic and what it means to move through the world. There's some modifications taking place.
Audrey.
Yeah, I was going to respond to that question as well. I mean, I don't think there's any teleology in evolution. So insofar as he saw, the emergence of humans as sort of the the end point of the evolutionary process, I don't view evolution in that way, and this is where my own sort of trying to work through the differences as I see them between atheism, humanism, and naturalism come into play. I like to embed my humanism in the naturalism. We're part of the natural process, and I think that's an unguided process, that there's no teleology in it at all.
And there's an element of caution, right? That it seems to me that Dietrich's great optimism concerning the human and his understanding of quality of life and solid structures of conduct revolve around human well-being. But I think at this point we have to kind of wrestle with some of the implications and some of the challenges posed by post-humanism or transhumanism, and which would entail a modification of what Dietrich gives us.
I'd like to answer the question differently, thanks to my friends for being the scholars of Dietrich that they are. But this calls up the question of whom we invoke as our sources of wisdom and inspiration. So I just wanted to actually bring up that the neighborhood, the ordinary communities that are working on a daily basis, that they should be recognized as part of that host of philosophy that we're referring to. This is an example of where conversations go far beyond and get intellectualized, where people can't reach it anymore. So shout out to the Black Humanist Association, the Black Atheist Association, and the Combahee River Collective. Look them up, 60s, 70s, and 80s women radicals of the African diaspora in Boston. And so if we put Aristotle next to Dietrich, next to the Combahee River Collective, all I can say is, wow, that's where our sources of inspiration are from.
And let's throw in Lorraine Hansberry, right? The Raisin in the Sun, there's some brilliant lines when the sister tells the mother, I'm tired of God getting credit for what people do, right? I mean, this is just wonderful stuff.
Audrey. All right, and it would not be a humanist gathering without a conversation about labels. Audrey is talking about the various ways that we all identify and asking whether humanism is the right label for what we're doing and I think what we want to do going forward.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the short answer is like the conversation should continue, right? And certainly we're not going to resolve it today, but I think it's important to constantly be evaluating and looking at the words that we use, the language we use, and who feels included and represented in that language and who doesn't, and why don't they. I actually think that humanism has less a sort of PR problem and more a problem of just unfamiliarity. There's just not literacy around humanism as a worldview, as a tradition. I was studying religion for years as a non-theist and never heard about humanism. How is it that I didn't hear about humanism? If I'm not hearing about humanism, there are so many other people who are not. I didn't hear about humanism until I was studying at a theological school that has a humanist library in it, and I still didn't hear about it from that institution. I heard about it from a Muslim colleague at an interfaith organization who said that the ways that I talked about what I believed sounded to him like humanism, and was it something that I had heard of, and was I familiar with it? And so if I'm hearing about humanism from a Muslim colleague rather than from an institution that has a humanist library, and this is not to put down Meadville Lombard, who does really amazing work, and I'm very grateful I went there. But I think it reveals that the conversation around labels and how should we identify and all of that is very important. But also, it can hold us back from actually using those labels because we get stuck in them. And I know that I'm biased because I'm a humanist professional. So I'm going to, of course, think that humanism is the label that we should use. I have a certain amount of the work that I do invested in that idea. And so I want to be able to step back from that as much as I can. But I think where I ultimately land on this is that we should continue the conversation and that we should practice a flexible humanism. I love that language. I think about my humanism, for example, as a humanism that includes my family members who identify as religious. My sister is a Lutheran. She's got 3 wonderful children. My family's very much on my mind because I've been spending the last few days with them. And she asked me when she had her youngest child if I would be the godparent to her child. And my sort of initial reflexive reaction was that made no sense. I was not comfortable with that language. That did not map onto the language that I use for myself. And so, I asked her, are you sure? Do you really think, isn't this going to be an issue? And what does this mean to you? And her response, I thought, was quite beautiful, and it represents the kind of flexible humanism that I hope we will all practice as we continue to have conversations around these labels. And her response was that it's not an issue that I'm an atheist being a godparent to one of her children. In fact, that was a part of why she asked. That's a part of what she sees as a value that I bring to that role, because she wants her children to grow up knowing that people in our family, though we share this label of family, believe very different things, and that they will grow up to be loved and to be respected and to be a part of this family, even if their identity or their beliefs do not match hers and how she identifies and what she believes. And I think that as we have these conversations around labels that can get so territorial and that can become, I think, much more fraught than they need to be, a kind of flexibility that doesn't hold us back from using labels and doesn't hold us back from advocating for certain labels that we think are valuable, but that also keeps us open to the process, I think is important.
Yeah, I knew what I wasn't, but I didn't have a good sense of what I was until I discovered William Jones is God a white racist. And then I had a way of naming myself. But the more I investigated, right, for personal reasons, but intellectual reasons, I saw that there's slippage, right? And so on the level of conversation, on the level of intellectual inquiry, I'm more than willing to entertain what is a humanist. But on a practical level, it seems to me we're not building a movement or an organization. We're building movements and organizations. And people will line up based upon what makes sense to them, right? And we give people options. It seems to me that that kind of webbing is what's necessary here. And I think we can have these sorts of conversations, but I don't think this is anything that ever gets resolved. Why would we be the exception, right? There isn't a system of meaning making in which this has been clarified. Right? How many versions of Christianity are there? Well, how many Christians are there?
Let's go with humanism.
Resolve.
Agreed.
Yeah,
Forgot to drop the mic.
Yeah, I don't think these matters can be resolved either. And I just look at the history of the naming practices of African Americans. If you look at my birth certificate, I was born in 1957. I'm described as a colored boy. So I was born as a colored boy. I became a Negro, became an Afro-American, became a Black American, became an African American. Now, those changes in nomenclature simply have something to do with people of African descent trying to figure out a way of describing themselves that made more sense, that was more inclusive, whatever kind of language you want to use. But it's not, it doesn't solve anything. Today, I tend to use Black because for me, Black is more political than African American is. So there's no resolution to this naming issue. I mean, personally, I describe myself as an atheist, a humanist, and a naturalist. And for me, those are nested concepts. So atheism tells you that I don't believe that there are any gods. That non-belief in gods is sort of is embedded in my commitment to humanity. But my commitment to humanity is sort of embedded in my naturalism because that gives me leverage against my own anthropocentrism. And anthropocentrism, I think, that is in fact an issue within humanism. So that's how I negotiate this.
Yeah, I think that's really important too, the political dimension of the labels that we use and how we weight them in different ways, in different spaces. This is something that I think about a lot as a member of the LGBTQ community and how I use queer more and more. In fact, I have it tattooed on my arm, in part because I want it to be something that I push myself to be more and more visible about because it's an identity that I can mask in certain ways or even use certain language to couch if I'm trying not to make people uncomfortable. And so I think thinking about the language that we use and perhaps trying to use multiple terms to clarify who we are, but also knowing that in certain spaces we're going to weight them in different ways, especially for the sort of political dimension of it, I think is an important aspect of this conversation.
I do see a hand up there, but I just wanted to add a couple of things.
So we're out of time for audience questions, but go ahead.
Okay. Defined but not confined by. That's my process of negotiation with labels. On the one hand, I think there's a political urgency to claim labels and have the power to define them but not be confined by them. There's also the implicit factor of how I am perceived, not just how I perceive myself, right? So rather than say I have a gender or a race or a class, that I am gendered, racialized, and classed. Right? That's based on social perception of me. So on the surface, I look like a brown woman, so I'll claim those labels for what they are, but I'm not confined by them. So defined but not confined by categories or labels enables us to keep doing the work and yet be self-reflexive, right? Which is what we pride in humanism.
All right. We do have just enough time for a quick wrap-up. So if each of our panelists would, if there's something you really want people to take away from this panel and walk out of here with, and when they're thinking about where humanism is going or needs to go, go ahead, Phil.
Hard to follow up that. I was like, that's another mic drop right there, what you just said. I guess I am a sociologist, so forgive me. I have to speak from that perspective. We're a really odd lot in this room. And we're really atypical, and we're really unusual. And what I mean by that is that most people who stop believing in God or the God they were raised to believe in or Allah or whatever, most people that no longer want to go to church because it's boring or whatnot, most people that walk away from religion, they walk away from it and then they focus on other things. And their identities are about their career, their family, their sexuality, their politics, their nationality, their language, the music they like, and the laundry list is quite long, and humanist is nowhere on that list in terms of self-identification, self-understanding, self-orientation. There's a tiny, tiny minority of humanity that when it loses its faith in supernatural beings and no longer subscribes to traditional religion, decides to identify with groups like this. Anthropologist Frank Pasquale estimates that between 2 and 3% of secular people would ever bother to join a group predicated on being humanist or secular or atheist, agnostic, or free thinking. So I guess to me, we are a unique group here in that we care about this, we want to talk about it, we want to mull over it, we want to try and label it. So I think that means we are a special, perhaps odd was the wrong word, we're special. And that means we face a lot of challenges, but it also means we have the opportunity to shape something because it matters to us. And while others maybe are more apathetic or have just moved on, we are sitting with this, and I think we sit with it because we are united by, we care about the big questions, we care about community, we care about making the world a better place. And that's a huge part of who we are, and that's why we're sitting in this odd, special place.
Special means something else in Minnesota nice, so I just wanted to make you aware.
It's okay, it means odd.
Oh, sorry.
So,
We are out of time for questions. Go ahead, Sunita. We are out of time for questions. Please go on, Sunita.
the only thing I want to remind you of is that moment we just had, Papa Hanua Mokuakea. And think of all that brings up, our faith and trust in community, in being open to thinking of new territories of thought, and come to my breakout session.
I want to end on a note of, I want to start my ending on a note of gratitude for the contributions of my fellow panelists who have deeply enriched me. Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I think one thing that I find, sort of one challenge or limitation that I find about events like this is that it's very sort of one-directional, right? We are sharing thoughts, you are listening, but in fact, there's a collective wisdom. You all have a great deal that you can teach us and that you can teach one another. And part of what we do in our community on Sundays is we have speakers come in and talk about topics, and then immediately after the speaker, we have something that we call the moment of connection, where we invite people to turn to one or more people near them and reflect together on a question posed by a member of our community that's related to the topic that the speaker addressed. And part of why we do that is that we think that being in community is not just about hearing from thought-provoking guests and speakers, though that is certainly something we offer and that many members of our community enjoy, but that also it means learning from the people around you and having the opportunity to reflect with other people on the content of what you've heard. And so what I would encourage you to do moving forward is to, I hope that you heard things today that you found challenging or encouraging, or whether you agreed or disagreed, that there was something here for you. I would encourage you to take the opportunity to talk to the people who were also here with you today, and to the people who weren't here, to talk to the other people in your life about what you've heard and what you're reflecting on, and to continue the conversations outside of this space today, and also come to my breakout sessions as well.
I guess I'd just like to end with a thank you to the people who organized this session, to those of you who have attended and listened to us sort of ramble on, and I'd also like to thank my fellow panelists.
Yeah, this has been a treat for me. These are colleagues and friends, so that an opportunity to chat with them I'm grateful for. It's also the case that I'm grateful to be back here. Minnesotans weren't so nice when my humanism was made public, but this was the first place to contact me and say, you know, we can't fully understand your story, but we celebrate it and we'd like to hear it. So thank you for that. I'll leave you with what my grandmother told me when she sent me off to college. She said, move through the world knowing your footsteps matter.